For young people, I'm sorry, but if you legalized marijuana, it would be the biggest part of your legacy. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it shouldn't be young people's biggest priority.
Right. It was our most popular.
No, I understand, because sometimes on the White House website and petitions, we get the same. So let's put it in perspective. Young people, I understand this is important to you, but you should be thinking about climate change, the economy, jobs, war and peace. Maybe way at the bottom, you should be thinking about marijuana. I'd separate out the issue of the criminalization of marijuana from encouraging its use. I think there is no doubt that our criminal justice system generally is so heavily skewed towards cracking down on nonviolent drug offenders that it has not just had a terrible effect on many communities, particularly communities of color, rendering a lot of folks unemployable because they got felony records, disproportionate prison sentences. It costs a huge amount of money to states, and a lot of states are starting to figure that out. But what I'm encouraged by is you're starting to see not just liberal Democrats, but also some very conservative Republicans recognize this doesn't make sense, including sort of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party.
They see the money.
And they see the money and how costly it is to incarcerate. So we may actually be able to make some progress on the decriminalization side. At a certain point, if enough states end up decriminalizing, then Congress may then reschedule marijuana. But I always say to folks, legalization or decriminalization is not a panacea. Do you feel the same way about meth? Do we feel the same way about coke? How about crack? How about heroin? And there is a legitimate, I think, concern about the overall effects this has on society and particularly vulnerable parts of our society. Substance abuse generally, legal and illegal substances, is a problem. Locking somebody up for 20 years is probably not the best strategy.
So,
look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spent. Take another look and take some time for hemp. Don't cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yeah, it's time for hemp. An acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rent. Well, it's time for hemp.
thank you for taking time for hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leach, and we are focusing today on how the criminal justice system has been impacted by prohibition. Leading off our discussions today, our first moderator, Peter Criss, co-founder of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, has been nice enough to agree to join us today, and he will be introducing you to the other moderator, and together they will bring to you a panel of amazing people. Peter?
Yes, Casper, thank you very much, and I really appreciate you doing this. It gives a wonderful opportunity for people from within the system to talk about it. Today's show, we're going to have, just to give you a quick rundown, Steve Downing, retired Deputy Chief LAPD, Judge Leonard Frieling, a former judge from Colorado, Michael Cindrich, who was a prosecutor, Police Captain Neill Franklin, retired Maryland State Police, and U.S. Navy intelligence specialist Larry Talley. Some of them will be coming up in the second hour. Some of them will be in the first hour. In fact, even the ones that are in the first hour may be sticking around for the second hour. So if you're listening, I would listen to the whole 2 hours because it's well worth it. Joining me is co-moderator Sean Dunagan. Sean Dunagan is former DEA, and Sean will be asking the questions, and the rest of us will be in the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sean.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And Casper, again, thank you for hosting this. It's certainly an important issue, as everyone here, and I hope everyone listening agrees. One thing that strikes me listening to and reading over the bios of the panelists who will be joining us both in this hour and the second hour is it really could be a panel of instructors at FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, certainly on par with the instructors that I had at Quantico, certainly on par with the instructors at the FBI's National Academy for Senior Law Enforcement Executives, and certainly on par or exceeding the experience and expertise of people who have testified before Congress and before the UN in the past on drug policy issues and drug control issues. So it really is a great event, and I thank you very much for hosting this. So with that, everybody here, all of our panelists have spent a lot of time and effort following distinguished law enforcement and legal careers in trying to educate the public about the drug war and advocating for reform. So I'd like to open it up with sort of an open question. What do you wish that more people knew about the war on drugs? And I guess we'll get it started with Leonard Frieling, if you would.
What do I, as a LEAP speaker, want the public to know about the war on drugs? Okay, let's start at the top. First, it is a misnomer. It is not a war on drugs. It is a war on people. You can't have a war on oil. You can have a war about oil, over oil, fueled by oil. It's the same thing with drugs. So it's a war on people. Now, who are those people? Well, first, everyone south of the U.S. border to about where the ice starts. It's a war on them. Then it's a war on our U.S. citizens who are illegally in the underground drug business one way or another. And then it's a war on our U.S. citizens who have the bad fortune to being at the wrong end of a SWAT team raid at the wrong address, where they shoot the dog and the old lady has a heart attack, and the officers are very sorry, but after all, there might have been a meth lab there, but oops, wrong address. So it's really a war on our people by our government. We can't have that. Our people don't need to tolerate that. This is America. So that would be the single most important thing I would want people to figure out about the war on drugs. The second biggest thing, and then I'll pass the mic, the second biggest thing is however you name it, however you describe it, however you look at it, it is not, cannot, will not ever be won. It is an unworkable model. It is an unworkable paradigm. The only thing guaranteed is the future income of private prisons, of, for example, DEA agents that need to be repurposed. I think those are the key things that strike me at the moment.
Great, thank you. And would anyone else like to chime in on that open question? What you wish more people knew about the war on drugs?
This is Steve Downing speaking. It's really a subject that could take hours and hours and hours and hours of examination, discussing what the harms of the war on drugs as compared to the harm of the drugs themselves. I've, over the years, compiled a list that goes to the harms of our communities. But before we get to the harms of our communities, it's the federal intervention, the federal use of federal dollars, of our taxpayer dollars, to leverage local law enforcement to do the job that they want to do. And so way away in Washington, we have these bureaucrats who have no sense of what true public safety is, and they have used our tax money to divert local law enforcement away from true public safety, away from true community policing, away from being peace officers, and turn them into drug warriors, finance them with military equipment and grants and all sorts of incentives that have drawn our police agencies into this arena that we call policing for profit. And the result of that is the escalation of the war on drugs, or as Lenny said, the war on the people, which it is, a war on the people. And so we've incarcerated 43 million people over the last 40 years, and we branded them as felons and as drug offenders, and we've denied them jobs, housing, educational opportunities. And by doing that, we've unraveled the social fabric of our communities. We take fathers and mothers from homes. We create foster children. We have created a burgeoning, totally corrupt drug treatment bureaucracy across the United States. Just a few weeks ago in the Los Angeles area, CNN revealed that there's 59 drug treatment centers that are totally corrupt. They bring in people from group foster homes who have never used a drug, who have never been exposed to a drug, and they use them as little puppets to charge the county for drug treatment. So the harms of the war on drugs extend into every thread of our society. There is nothing that it doesn't touch that's not harmful. There is no metric that says the war on drugs has been successful.
Unless you own stock in a prison industrial complex.
That's true.
That's right. It's it's striking, and thank you for the answers. It's striking that we're having this conversation on a show called Time for Hemp, and yet I don't believe the word marijuana has been uttered yet. It's interesting. Of course, there's been a dramatic shift in public opinion regarding marijuana, the decriminalization or even legalization of both medical and recreational use of marijuana in recent years. But LEAP's position really goes further than that. To include regulated legalization of all drugs. And I was wondering, how would you explain to somebody the rationale of why legalize drugs other than marijuana? And Mike, I guess since you joined LEAP a couple of years ago, I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, so the perspective on marijuana as opposed to other drugs, is that your question?
Yes, yeah. Why? There's great public support for the decriminalization, at least, or legalization of marijuana, but less so for the legalization or decriminalization of other drugs. So, what about LEAP's position is attractive to you?
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is whether it's marijuana or other drugs, we're not necessarily looking at the drug, we're looking at the impact that prohibition has on society. And I think whether you're talking about marijuana, cocaine, LSD, no matter what it is, there are different issues that are going to arise with personal consumption, with sale, a lot of different areas related to those specific drugs. But I think what it really comes down to is, how society is handling this prohibition and what the costs are to society. I mean, I think kind of going back to your last question a little bit, one thing about the war on drugs is it's fueled by demand. And I think prohibition in our country has increased the demand for street-level drugs, which in turn has increased the supply of those drugs and the manufacturing of those drugs in other countries. I think if you go down to some of the South American countries, you speak to those leaders, they're going to tell you that if you didn't have such a large demand for drugs in the United States and other developed countries, then you're not going to see this organized crime really flourishing in these underdeveloped countries. And I think that's a really important point to take away from this. But really, I think just the prohibition in general. One thing that we look at, and one thing that I've seen come up in many different conversations, and it's a solid point that LEAP makes, is that when you have these street level drugs that are unregulated, that's what causes the problems. This is what's causing deaths. Heroin, for example, you don't know the different cuts. You don't know how strong it is. People are going out there and dying. And, and then on the other side of it, we're turning these addicts into criminals, essentially, and locking them up in cages. And the prisons are, it's a revolving door. People are going in, they're coming out, they're not getting any treatment, they're not getting any rehabilitation. When they get back out on the streets, they're going and using drugs again. And if they can't afford those drugs, they're going to commit crimes in order to get those drugs. So I think that, really, whether it's marijuana or any of these other drugs, it's just a failed system. We really need some change. And I think LEAP is a great organization, and it brings a lot of credibility having former law enforcement officers, current and former law enforcement, supporting this position.
Yeah, it's interesting, and yes, for those that are worried about it, I'm going to mention it. When we formed LEAP in the beginning, we named it Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Now, we didn't name it Law Enforcement Against Marijuana Prohibition or Drug Prohibition. We named it Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and it goes to exactly what Mike was just saying. When you have consenting adults that want to do something together, whether it's buy and sell drugs or whatever, and you make that banned, you prohibit it, you create crime in your society out of things that had no victims, really. They weren't doing it to other people, they were just doing it amongst themselves. And if there is money connected to that activity, you also create violence in your streets, because if those people have a dispute over the money, they have no access to the court system to settle that dispute, so they take it to the streets. So LEAP, on a much broader term, is really addressing the idea. In fact, it's perfect, and I'm glad Steve used the two terms. We talked about police officers and peace officers. The difference between those two is policing is running around and checking and making everything sure everybody's doing it right and all that other stuff. Peace officers are called in when the peace is disturbed and restore peace. That's what our job was. That's what we were trained to do. And that's, in a free society, the only thing we should be doing is settling disputes between combating people, not trying to prevent people from doing what they choose to do. Just another point of view.
Yeah, and it really comes down to the right for the individual to choose what's best for their own body, and it shouldn't be the government telling us what we can and can't put in our body. And when it comes down to it, you're putting drug offenders in cages with murderers, rapists, and some of the most violent people in our society, and it's just unbelievable that we're still in this day and age that we're still doing that. And I see it on a daily basis with clients I'm representing in the criminal courts here in San Diego, California. It's a shame to see that we're locking drug offenders up. In some cases, it's addictions. In some cases, it's just people that are trying to make a living, and people that they're selling to are consenting adults. People that have decided that, hey, I want to do this. I'm choosing whether it's marijuana or another substance over alcohol, or over another way to relax or wind down at the end of the day. But in the end, we're locking these people up, and it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's interesting. I think there's if not a consensus, certainly a large percentage of the public that would agree that treating individual addicts as criminals is wrong and not very productive, and not a good way to approach the drug problem writ large. But that raises the question of decriminalization, right? I mean, we could cease arresting low-level drug users and addicts by implementing just decriminalization, right? It becomes a civil violation or a minor infraction, a traffic ticket, rather than a criminal charge. So, do you see that decriminalization as opposed to regulated legalization? Are there any advantages to that? Are there any disadvantages to that approach?
Remind everybody that alcohol prohibition was decriminalization. We didn't arrest users. We just arrested the manufacturers and the producers and the sellers. So that didn't work real well then. I don't think it'll work any better now. But
in fact, it is the single best thing we could possibly do for the drug cartels, because what we're saying is all of your customers can more safely, legally use your product. But we'll guarantee that we, the government, will keep your price nice and high by keeping it illegal, so the underground supply train isn't hurt at all. They're assisted because their customers can be more at ease knowing that it's just decriminalized as opposed to a class 4 felony. I think it does the precise opposite of what it's intended to do in thinking.
There's a program in Vancouver, British Columbia, where they allow the addict to bring the black market purchased dope into a clinic where they shoot up. So that's a tiny form of decriminalization. The result of that program has been that even though they might get bad dope on the street, if they overdose, their lives are saved. There's been a 50% reduction in HIV infection in that area. And in that immediate region, there has been a decrease in the kinds of crimes that you would call addict crimes. So that part of the program should prove to our government that we can deal with the addicts very effectively. And another advantage of that program is that more addicts are voluntarily entering treatment than those that are put in treatment through the criminal justice system. So the program should prove to our government that this is a good way to treat addicts. This is a good way to contribute to a vital community, but at the same time, you have left in place the black market, which is delivering all of the violence, because that black market, Coors and Budweiser don't shoot it out on the street for distribution territory.
Well, in Colorado sometimes.
Coors in Colorado, and you never hear of anyone selling Jim Beam on the school grounds. So, if we add to that the regulation, control, and full legalization, you're going to take care of both ends of this problem, and you're going to do it in a way that's less expensive to the taxpayer.
Expense, right? And earlier, both you and Lenny mentioned money and the drug war. And, of course, one of the places where money and drugs and government kind of meet is with civil and asset forfeiture. And I was wondering if you could, if any of you would address that issue, kind of walk through the process, how it works, what a civil forfeiture is, and what role it's had in kind of perpetuating the drug war.
Let me give a 30-second nutshell. The state comes in, does a drug bust. They bring the feds in to seize all property thought to have been purchased by drug money and all property to facilitate the manufacture, distribution of drugs, and basically every bit of property they can get. The feds seize it in federal court in a civil action and then kick back a percentage to the state that let the feds handle the forfeiture.
Let me give you an example here in California. This is a story, and this story is repeated time and time again by the Department of Justice. The city of Anaheim, they don't want marijuana dispensaries, but it's legal in California. The people voted 55% to have marijuana dispensaries. So the city, who is subordinate, chartered by the state, sovereign, instead of going to the state to resolve their problems, they run to the federal government, the DEA and the DOJ. So the DOJ isn't going to prosecute the medical marijuana dispensary because they're going to open up again somewhere. So what they're doing now is they're seizing property from landowners. And Anaheim, this man and wife, they're full retirement, a dentist and an engineer. They own a building, commercial building, worth $1.5 million. They were asked to rent space to a medical marijuana dispensary. They checked everything to do with the medical marijuana dispensary, legal across the board. They ensured that it was. They had lawyers look at it. They read all of the edicts that were put out by the government. They were assured that they were renting to a legal enterprise. They rented to the dispensary. The DOJ, at the request of Anaheim, without notice, with no prior letter, seized their building under civil asset forfeit seizure. Now, we got to understand this. Anaheim also knows that if they're successful, they're going to get 80% of that $1.5 million for city coffers. And if you look across the country, you'll see that these local cities and local police departments are bringing in millions and millions and millions of dollars every year under civil asset seizure. One more example of the leverage the federal government has provided. One more example of policing for profit. They're seizing cars, they're seizing buildings. Now, these people, when they were served the seizure, they immediately ejected the dispensary tenants. The DOJ is continuing with that prosecution, civil. There's nothing that shows that those people purchased that building with criminal proceeds. They merely rented one of several locations in their building to a medical marijuana dispensary. That's what our United States government is doing.
Yeah, just a quick comment on it. I just want to make some clarification for the people that are listening. There are two types of forfeitures that we do in this society. One is called criminal forfeiture, and that is if you are arrested and charged and then convicted of a crime and you have proceeds from that crime that you were convicted of the government can seize those proceeds because you were convicted of the crime. Then we have what we're mainly talking about here, and that's civil forfeiture. And just so everybody listening understands this, and Stephen just pointed out very well, you do not even have to be charged with a crime. You don't have, in fact, in civil forfeiture, you have to prove that you're innocent. They don't have to prove that you're guilty of anything. They just seize your property. And I think that is horrendous in a free society.
That's correct, Peter. And it's another example of, in my opinion, an unconstitutional intrusion on the sovereignty of states. Because in this case, this example I gave you, California has an asset seizure law. California has a civil asset seizure law, as a matter of fact. But the threshold of proof requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So in effect, it requires a criminal prosecution. The city of Anaheim refused to follow state law. They violated state sovereignty and went to the federal government. And under the asset seizure equitable sharing program of the federal government's civil asset seizure, 90% of all seizures under that program are drug-related, and 80% of all seizures are unaccompanied by a criminal prosecution. And what they're doing is that they will surveil somebody, look at their property, find out, like in the case of these two people, their property is free and clear. There's an easy $1.5 million to pick up, and that's what they're doing. They're thugs. They're absolute thugs in doing this. And then they get on television, like our local DOJ guy, and he lies about what he's doing, because his people have publicly said that they're dedicated to wiping out every dispensary in California, even though they're legal.
In Colorado, we see something similar where we have a Colorado state forfeiture law, and I'm referring to the civil state forfeiture as opposed to the other one Peter described, criminal. The reason that Colorado has the feds do the seizing is that the federal forfeiture law gives the seizing authority extra powers and gives the victim less defenses than the state law does. So it's easier for it to be seized federally with the kickback system.
Mike Cindrich here from San Diego. We see it here a lot as well with the dispensaries. We actually see, the federal involvement on a couple levels, but especially with the dispensaries, we call them smash and grab operations, because basically what's happening is, a group of 15 to 30 agents will hit up a dispensary. They'll detain individuals who are present on scene, but really what they're doing is they're looking for money, they're looking for product, they're looking for computers, other equipment that can be forfeited and sold, and basically the money's coming back to the feds and to the city law enforcement. So we're seeing that a lot, and very few prosecutions are coming out of these smash and grab style raids. But we're also seeing it with grow operations. What'll happen is San Diego Police Department will get a call about a grow. They'll come on scene. They find plants. First thing they do is they call the Narcotics Task Force. Now, the Narcotics Task Force is made up of both state and federal agents. So some of these agents are cross-sworn as DEA agents. And, this takes a situation where if this is a legal grow under state law, and even if the grow gets cut down and equipment seized and marijuana seized, if we can succeed in state court in defending the action, then the defendant would be entitled to the return of their property and their equipment. Well, once the Narcotics Task Force and these federal agents get involved, all bets are off pretty much as far as getting that equipment back, getting the marijuana back. So even if they succeed in state court, they still lost essentially their entire operation.
And think about what you're describing. You're talking about the major cause of armed home invasions in the United States. Yep. The armed home invasions in the United States are done by SWAT teams in drug cases, not by bad guys.
Exactly, and we see it all the time here in San Diego. And in a marijuana case recently, a case that I'm handling right now, my client and a couple of his buddies had 2 of their dogs shot. This was a no-knock raid. They basically opened the door, threw flash grenades in, came in, guns drawn, and 2 of the dogs got shot. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And my client said to the officers, he said, hey, all you guys needed to do was knock on the door. If you had a search warrant, we would have let you in. We would have let you search the whole place. You didn't have to come in like that. And especially in a lot of these marijuana offenders. I mean, these are peaceful, nonviolent individuals, and this type of SWAT style, shooting dogs, it's just wholly unnecessary.
Well, this goes to the whole militarizing of police, which is a whole other thing, and this comes directly out of the drug war. And there's Randy Balco has got a new book out on that particular issue. I used to work with an old timer when I first started on the PD, and he used to say that if you're going to have in your society a military and a police, you should train the military on the East Coast and the police on the West Coast. They should never make contact with each other because they're so profoundly different jobs, but we have blended the two of them. And also, in everything that's being said here today, I said to my old department who started a drug unit a year after I left, and I was back there one day visiting, and they were going down through a list of stuff they were seized, and they were talking about the price they were going to sell it back to the guy they seized it from for. And I stood up and I said, oh, boy, And they said, yeah, we know your drug stuff, Pete. I said, no, not my drug stuff. I spent 20 years in this job, and it was a great job. It would have been a perfect job if we worked on commission, and now you guys are working on commission.
That's sad. Yeah,
it is. Stephen, your department, the LAPD, has unfortunately become one of the more militarized big city forces in the country. So I was wondering, your impression of what you hear Peter saying about the militarization of law enforcement, particularly as it pertains to the war on drugs.
I'll say this: before all of this started, before all of this militarization imposed by the federal government started, the LAPD invented SWAT, and they invented SWAT operations for a very good reason, and that was to deal with highly volatile, highly dangerous situations that were beyond the capacity of first responders. And over the years, the LAPD has continued to train and deploy SWAT in a fashion that most of the rest of the country does not. For example, LAPD does not allow SWAT to serve search warrants unless there is a specific showing that the service of that search warrant involves a degree of danger and the possibility of weapons that are beyond the capacity of first responders or the serving entity to deal with. In LAPD, you do not see SWAT on the street in their SWAT clothes. You do not see the SWAT equipment rolling out of the barn in Los Angeles unless there is a legitimate SWAT call-out that is evaluated by the commanders in SWAT, not the commanders on the street. They make the decision. So there are very rigorous uses of SWAT in the LAPD. And if SWAT was used across the country and managed like the LAPD manages SWAT, we wouldn't see a lot of dogs being shot. We wouldn't see SWAT going into medical marijuana dispensaries. We wouldn't see SWAT like they do in my little city, Long Beach. I see SWAT officers walking down the street in their fatigues with their big guns. At our Christmas parade in Long Beach, they brought out their tank and put it in the Christmas parade. And I told the chief of police later, I said, I felt like I was standing in Moscow's Red Square in Moscow, watching the big equipment roll by so that you could demonstrate to the people of Long Beach your military might. I said it made me sick. But the problem with this militarization is most of the time large major city organizations like LA, they know where to draw the line on the use of SWAT. But the federal government is handing out these tanks and these big guns and military equipment to every little podunk department and sheriff county across the country. I dealt with a case up in Oakdale, a 28-man police department with a SWAT team. You can't even select a SWAT team from a 28-man police department. much less train them. LAPD, out of 10,000, it's a force of 10,000 sworn personnel. They have 7 SWAT teams to cover the entire city, 18 divisions, around the clock. Those SWAT teams train 50% of their on-duty time. And that's why their success rate in handling situations without having to use force, without having to use weapons, they have an incredible record for coming out of situations without having to use deadly force. 95% of their incidents never result in the use of deadly force. But in these smaller jurisdictions across the country and towns like Long Beach, they're not managed correctly, and they take everything they can get from the federal government, even though the city might not be able to maintain that equipment. It takes a lot of time and personnel and expense to take care of those big guns, to keep those tanks greased and running and all that. And so they don't have that money, and they don't maintain them well, and so then when they deploy them in the field, they pose a danger to the community, like that Oakdale. You know, these guys go out with big guns. They go into a neighborhood with children. They don't look the property over before they do their seizure. They don't see that there's children's things in the backyard. They don't examine even the guy's record to know that he's never had any kind of criminal violation in his life. But yet they think they need these big guns to enter the house and shoot the dog or accidentally discharge a round that goes through 5 neighboring houses. So that's the problem. The federal government is a problem. The federal government using the leverage of our tax money to corrupt our police agencies and give them all this stuff and stir up all this testosterone where they want to have these big tanks and so that they can show their muscle. It's just ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, I understand, the role of the federal government in donating surplus equipment and, the increasing number of drug raids and paramilitary drug raids. But, I'm curious if you and Peter could speak to sort of the thought process of, say, a police chief in a 50-man department, right, who has been on the job, say, 30 years, certainly has a historical perspective to understand that this is not how policing was done 30 years ago. Why does that happen? Is it something fundamental about the way the police view the public? Is there a breakdown of trust? Why that dramatic change in tactic? I understand the federal government and the drug war, but why is that happening sort of in how police view themselves and their job?
I think we've created, thanks to Nixon, and I had this vision of them sitting around in the office deciding what they're going to call this thing, and somebody saying, why don't we call it the new prohibition? And somebody else saying, oh, no, don't use that word. Everybody in America knows that doesn't work. But let's call it a war on drugs. And what we have done is we have turned military by using those terms. The terms are very important. You talk about changing drug policy or ending changing our prohibition policy, and that's a correction, that's a change. You mentioned ending the war on drugs, and people will respond to you with war metaphors. They say, that's surrender, that's giving up. And our law enforcement predominantly still is male, and you got these young men out there with these toys to play with, and then you tell them that it's okay if they play with the toys, and you give them a whole bunch of toys, they're going to play with them. They're just human beings.
I think that a lot of the culture that's been built into law enforcement since Nixon's announcement on drugs is if you look at the ratcheting up process, every year we look at the seizures and all the metrics having to do with the war on drugs, and every year it's a failure, and of course they have to know it's a failure, and so what they do is they ratchet it up. So they ratchet it up with legislation, let's give military equipment, they ratchet it up with cop grants, they ratchet it up with task forces, they ratchet it up with fusion centers and intelligence sharing. They deploy task forces all over the country, and they ratchet it up with a mandatory minimum sentencing and 3 strikes laws and building more prisons. And the mantra is always tough on crime, tough on crime, tough on crime. Well, it's easy, and especially politically, it's easy to say, let's slam these suckers in jail, let's lock them up, let's put them away, and the public responds emotionally, rah, 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 the politicians get elected, and nobody has said to them, I think it's starting to be heard now, let's stop this nonsense of being tough on crime, and let's start being smart on crime. Let's stop this nonsense of this concept of zero tolerance. I made the statement the other day before a group. I said a red flag should go up any time a person in a position of responsibility utters the word zero tolerance, because that means they do not have the confidence to make a decision in their discipline. They do not have the compassion to see the differences between situations, and they do not have the administrative or managerial skills to make the kind of decisions that create a thriving institution. And man, these people are using zero tolerance at the drop of a hat. The head of the DEA, the head of the DEOJ, the politicians. And we have to steer that conversation away from being tough on crime to being smart on crime. And I think that's the culture that's been created over these years. And I think that's why you have chiefs of police that get their back up and say, we got to put these guys in jail, because they have transitioned to begging for federal money across the country. They're criticized if they don't get so many grants every year. And it's completely destroyed the concept of the peace officer in our communities. I always say peace officers don't have enemies. Everybody a peace officer comes in contact with is entitled to the protections of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and they've completely forgotten that. They wink at it.
It's interesting when you say that. I was a senior field training officer before I started getting promoted, and the last day of my session with people, I would tell them that understand one of the most important things about our job, and that is that every time you arrest somebody, you're arresting your boss. And, that's a little different way to look at it. One other thing I want to throw in real quick. We've mentioned prisons a bunch of times here so far, and I just want to mention two things about prisons. One is 90% of the people that we have locked up in this country have one thing in common, and that is they are coming home. Only 10% of the people we lock up are in there for life. The rest of them are coming back. And you have to ask yourself, when they come back, do you want them coming back better than they went away or worse? Right now, we're sending them back worse than they went away. And the second thing I want to mention about prisons, because I never let the word prison be said in my presence without me saying this, and that is we have the largest and one of the most efficient prison systems on the planet, and we in America do not have one drug-free prison in America. And if you can't keep drugs out of prison, who is going to believe that drug-free school sign the next time they read it?
1 hour south of me in Colorado, in Fremont County, is the largest penal colony on the planet. This is America.
Yeah, Lenny, I was wondering if you could address the and Mike as well, some of the legal issues surrounding that what we've been discussing, the militarization of police. I mean, is there a limit? I mean, obviously, Posse Comitatus Act from post-Reconstruction, the military can't be used for domestic law enforcement. But, I mean, is there a distinction there if the tactics and the equipment used by law enforcement, right, are identical to those used by the military? I mean, is there any level of force that the police could not use in serving a warrant against a nonviolent drug offender?
I think it is a little misleading to criticize the choice of weaponry. I think to the extent that a modern police officer can be faced with some serious weaponry in, say, a bank robbery, as we learned with the famous disastrous FBI shootout in California, don't blame the weapons. It's the training and the application. A surgeon may have a saw to chop body parts off in their arsenal, but they don't use it much. Don't take their saw away. Just aim it in the proper direction, and we're not doing that now. On the prison subject, legally, in my 37 years of practicing law and teaching and lecturing and writing, I have yet to come across a single example of conflict of interest that is more obscene, more egregious, more shocking than the fact that a private prison could even exist in the free world, let alone in America. It's beyond my ability, and I like to think I have a good command of words, and I don't have a word for how bad and wrong this is.
Absolutely.
One of the arguments for prison privatization, of course, is cost. Right? I mean, as with other privatization of other historically government-controlled functions. So, how do we scale that back? I mean, is there any possibility in the future of scaling back the growth of private prisons now that money has become part of that, lobbying has become part of that process of how prisons are built and where and how they're staffed? I mean, are we at the point of no return with regard to how prisons are run, or is there anything that can be done to dismantle that system?
The only way a private prison system can ethically be run is if the contract is upside down and they are paid more to have fewer people incarcerated, as opposed to the Motel 8 model, which is fill every room you have so that you can build more rooms next door.
Right.
Well, that's of course what keeps this concept of tough on crime and mandatory minimum sentencing and 3 strikes laws. That's what keeps all of that alive, because those private prison CEOs lobby Congress to keep those kinds of laws alive so they can keep their prisons full. It should be illegal. It should be a crime to start with for anybody in the business of private prisons to lobby Congress. But this is this thing across the board. Look what we've started in the Middle East with mercenary organizations like Blackwater. Don't you think that Blackwater is now being deployed in the United States? Don't you think that since we've passed the Military Appropriations Act, where we are allowing now for the military to operate on American soil, and we are allowing now for United States citizens taken from American soil to be held in a Guantanamo environment without representation or due process, don't you think that the next ratcheting up of the war on drugs, if it hasn't been done secretly already, is to transfer drug enforcement to the military and outsource it to outfits like Blackwater across the United States?
Now I'm going to have nightmares.
Well, you should be having nightmares, because it's all there. It's all there ready to go. The law is there. They're going to do it, and they're going to say it's legal, just like what they're doing with intelligence gathering now. They say it's legal because we made this bizarre interpretation of the law. That's what's happening. And they have done nothing with this drug war but ratchet it up. They haven't stopped to look and think and act like civilized human beings. They've just ratcheted it up. Build more prisons, lock up more people, destroy more communities. And that's what the drug war is doing. And unless something happens that we stop it, and maybe our tipping point with marijuana is going to help get us there. Just today I read the DEA is now ordering armored car companies not to pick up cash at legal medical marijuana dispensaries. How tyrannical can that be? It's something that it's really an edict. If that directive was written by petty thugs, you'd understand it. But it's written by one of the most powerful agencies of the U.S. government. They're creating crime in our communities by doing things like that.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned earlier that kind of getting back to that issue, the conflict between federal and state marijuana laws. And, it's interesting that the federal government really hasn't made legal challenges on preemption grounds to those laws, but they're continuing to enforce the federal law, if anything, more vigorously, both through, direct enforcement, civil asset forfeiture, as well as the IRS, right, tax laws and those sorts of things. And now what Stephen was mentioning with the regulated armored truck companies. I was wondering if you could talk about how you see that playing out. I mean, ultimately, it seems that, there's a difference between the state law and federal law on this issue that only seems to be expanding because, it seems clear that most successful drug law reforms are going to occur at the state level before we see any real movement at the federal level. I was wondering if you could talk about that. I mean, how is that going to play out? Will Colorado and Washington be free to enforce their laws as the voters wish? Or do you see the federal government intervening?
Yeah, I think with the medical marijuana issue especially, I think that the change is going to have to come from the federal level. And I think you mentioned that, oftentimes we see the change starting at the state level, and that's what we've seen with medical marijuana. But now we're at the point where something needs to be done federally, because Washington and Colorado can legalize marijuana. They can, create a mechanism for distribution and taxation. But when it comes down to it, as long as the federal government considers marijuana a Schedule I controlled substance, and as long as they continue to enforce marijuana laws, then really it's going to be extremely difficult for these states to move forward with the different laws that they've put into place. So I think really what we're looking at is some type of reclassification or declassification on a federal level, and the freedom for states that have put into place marijuana or medical marijuana related laws, the freedom for them to be able to legislate and operate independent of federal laws or federal intervention when it comes to marijuana. And I think that that's going to be extremely important. We see it in California with medical marijuana all the time, and we can do what we want with medical marijuana, but when it really comes down to it, the feds still have the power to come in. They still have the power to raid, to prosecute, to forfeit. And it makes it very difficult. It frustrates the idea that the states have a certain level of power to legislate for the health and safety of their citizens, and the federal government's essentially taking that away from us.
This will not be decided in the courts by the Fed suing the states or any of the states suing the Fed. It's already been decided by the voters, which is all the elected officials care about. They're the ones that are the bosses. So right now, the DEA keeps doing what the DEA does because they're continuing to do what they do and nobody's telling them not to. The politicians will absolutely, I promise, respond to the polling and the electorate. They will be forced to back off. They'll do it with a whimper, not a bang. It'll just gradually fade away, and sadly and painfully for those who are losing lives, property, and getting convictions where all they had was an addiction, we're in a transition period. We're at the event horizon of this new reality. It's a paradigm shift. So if you say what's going to happen next week, tough question. If you ask me what's going to happen in 5 years, we won't be having this discussion because I believe the feds won't be staging these guerrilla war tactics to just continue doing what they're doing because that's what they do.
Yeah, in 20 years, I think we're going to be looking back on this as a civil rights issue, and we're going to be just ashamed that our country has been locking up people for marijuana-related offenses. I mean, in many cases, what we're doing is we're depriving people of medicine. They've gone through dozens of different types of medications to treat their symptoms, and then maybe they're taking 7 different pills. And most recently, the documentary by Dr. Sanjay Gupta with CNN, and he followed a young individual who had seizures and was on several different medications. And, all it took was marijuana to reduce the number of seizures from a couple hundred a month to about 2 or 3. And, really what we're doing by criminalizing marijuana use is we're depriving people of a medicine in many cases that can help them. And it's just, there's something needs to be changed, and we're going to be looking back on this. And, everyone that's on the front lines of this movement that are fighting to legalize marijuana and other drugs, I think we're going to be looked at in a very favorable light in the future when we look back on this movement and on everything that's taken place.
Our government action is going to be looked back on with shame and embarrassment that we had a government behaving the way our government is behaving. And at the end of the day, I don't think the buck stops at the president's desk. I think the buck stops with the civilians, with the citizens. I think, gentlemen, the buck stops here.
And, I certainly agree with regard to marijuana, but I think that it's a more difficult argument with regard to other drugs for people who really haven't looked at the issue more broadly as, the failure of prohibition and the inability of the government to successfully regulate adult consensual behavior. So say 10-year time frame, 5-year time frame, and the war on marijuana is looked back as kind of silly. Do you see that as paving the way forward for a regulated system of legalization for other drugs? Or do you think the public perceives that so distinctly that those efforts will continue.
The single most important fact I see is this. People are seeing that in Colorado, just because marijuana is legal, people who were smoking before are smoking now, and people who were not smoking before are not taking it up. It makes it much easier for us to explain what we've been explaining, that if heroin goes on sale at Walmart tomorrow in an hour, we're not all going to drop off the show to get there on time to take advantage of the sale. It doesn't change the addict population, or in the case of marijuana, the user population, by much at all, and marijuana is demonstrating that.
With the other drugs, we're really, I think organized crime is going to be a large focus. And when we look at how we're fueling violence in so many different countries by allowing our citizens to purchase drugs off the black market, I think that's going to be another controlling factor. And I think with marijuana, we can look at it and say, it's not a harmful drug. It's silly to have it be an illegal Schedule I controlled substance. But when you look at other drugs, maybe you can't make the same arguments. But I think one of the important arguments is going to be that by having these illegal substances and sending money, the drugs come here, the money goes back to these other countries, it fuels organized crime, it causes deaths, countless deaths because of it. Really all that it takes is the government stepping in, regulating this industry, and then you're not going to have the same black market sales. Someone mentioned earlier, you can't buy Jim Beam on the playground, and that's absolutely the case. People, even the marijuana dispensaries here, they're not selling to minors. They're not going to risk their operation, their employees, all these patients that they help out by selling to someone who's underage or someone who doesn't have a card. The liquor store people that own liquor stores, they're not risking their license, they're not risking their jobs by, for the most part, by selling to underage people. And I think you're going to see the same thing with a regulated drug system in the United States.
Lenny, when you were saying that about people using, you got to remember that terrible tragedy when we ended alcohol prohibition and we fell into a drunken stupor. The whole country became alcoholics and we lost World War II. I mean, come on.
The carnage on the roads overnight was unbelievable. The roads became impassable. Nobody showed up for work the next day because they were all either hungover or getting drunk again.
Yeah.
It was horrible, I know. I wasn't born, and I remember it like it wasn't yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because the anti-repeal people, that's exactly what they said would happen. We're being joined by Neill Franklin, a retired Major, Maryland State Police and current Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and Larry Talley, Intelligence Specialist. And welcome aboard, gentlemen. And Sean, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Casper. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in on this discussion. As I mentioned earlier, this panel of guests is quite remarkable, and certainly on par with any panel of drug policy experts anywhere in terms of diversity of background and experience on the issue, and also with regard to their honest approach to the problems and what we can do to solve them. So just to kind of pick up back where we were discussing the marijuana issue, the reforms that have been made with regard to marijuana policy, and what that means for other drugs. So, Neill, Major Franklin, if you would, LEAP's position on drug reform, drug policy reform, is a little bit different and more broad, and I would say more comprehensive than a number of other organizations out there in this universe, in that you advocate not only for the legalization of marijuana, but of other drugs as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that strategy and that position and how you came to it.
Well, definitely for the legalization of not just other drugs, but all drugs. I didn't come to that realization. It was actually the founders of this wonderful organization, and one of which is on the show with us. That is Peter Criss. The other being Jack Cole. When they were thinking about this wonderful organization, I guess about 12 years ago, they realized that we had to consider all drugs. As a matter of fact, Peter consistently speaks to the fact that prohibition doesn't work, and I like the analogy that he uses of the very first law of prohibition, which was the fruit from the forbidden tree. It didn't work then, and it won't work today. the bottom line is that when you prohibit a substance that people want, that is readily available, that can be made available, and you prohibit it, you generate a very violent criminal marketplace for selling that product. That's what happened with alcohol prohibition back in the 1920s, and we have done it again here in the 1970s and up until this point today with the prohibition of other drugs, of which were legal at one time. All of these drugs that we currently prohibit today, from heroin to cocaine and others, were legal at one time. So the main reason that we at LEAP want to end prohibition for all of these drugs is, number one, which in my opinion is most important, and that is the violence. Not just the violence in this country, but globally, especially down through Central America, where the trafficking routes have become treasured by the cartel, valued by the cartel, generating billions of dollars for the cartel, all because the United States is pretty much the number one consumer of these drugs, making those trafficking routes very popular and very valuable. And number two, we want to restore the public trust in policing. Because of these policies of prohibition, we have created a very huge divide between police and the citizens of this country. And we need to restore that trust, and the most effective way we can do that is by ending the prohibition of drugs. So we're no longer violating the Fourth Amendment rights of our citizens, the Fifth Amendment rights of our citizens. If I'm not mistaken, earlier during the show, you guys were talking about civil forfeiture and how that is, in my opinion, a direct violation of the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution. The unwarranted searches, the wonderful dynamic entries we use on these search warrants and what have you. And the list is long, as you know. One more thing is that, unfortunately, in law enforcement in this country, we tend to target communities of color and poor communities, which has created a big problem as relates to the numbers and the numbers of people we're putting into prison who are from communities of color. And the wonderful book that was written by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, for your listeners who have not yet had the opportunity to read that book, I think they should. It's a good read. So it definitely points to another tragedy of the war on drugs, of the prohibition of drugs, as we continue to fill up our prisons with prisoners for drug use and drug selling. And predominantly those numbers, those people in our prisons, are disproportionately represented by blacks and people of color.
That's right. And, it's the racial disparity in how the drug war is prosecuted and its effects. It's sort of perplexing to a lot of people like me, right? In that, that I've certainly known and worked with a lot of cops during my time with DEA. I wouldn't characterize any of them as overtly racist. That's right. Not to say that they weren't. That was never my impression of any of them. And yet the effect of the drug war is clearly there's a disparate impact on communities of color, and as you mentioned, poor communities, and in parts of our country on the American Indian communities as well. And I was wondering, how does that happen? You were with the Maryland State Police and the Baltimore Police Department for a total of 34 years. You certainly witnessed as much on the ground drug law enforcement as probably anyone alive. How does that happen? Why is that the net effect? Is it access to counsel? Is it deliberate on the part of law enforcement? Is it institutional? Is it something about our laws? Kind of why do we have this problem with the net effect of the drug war?
That's a great question. And see, it's not just a bad policy. It's a bad application of the policy as well. And how does that happen? It happens for a number of reasons. Even though we know that blacks and whites and just about every demographic you look at in this country use and distribute drugs at relatively the same rates, we tend to have this disproportionate number when it comes to who we target, who we charge, who we convict, and who gets longer sentences. So it's also an improper application of the policy. So how do we end up targeting communities of color at this disproportionate level? Well, first of all, it begins with most of our communities of color in our urban centers are poor communities. And when I say poor, I don't just mean financially poor. I mean politically poor. They have no political power. Once we started this vicious cycle of sending poor people into prison, blacks into prison, in many of our communities, when they return to society, they still have no voting rights or power. Therefore, they have no political influence, no muscle there. And it's easier for policing to implement, to practice, or to put in force this policy in communities of color, because there's very little, if any, pushback. Now, don't get me wrong. There is a difference between how drugs are distributed within many of our poorer communities than how they are distributed in affluent America, gated America. We have open-air drug markets. Yes, we do have the violence in our streets, the shootings, the running gun battles, and the drive-by shootings. Policing is a numbers game. Unfortunately, that's where we are today. The political powers of our cities and the policing hierarchy are requiring our police officers to go out there and to produce numbers. So why do they want numbers? One of the main reasons they want numbers is for burn grant applications, for federal grants, federal grant money. We need numbers to put in the applications to demonstrate that we have this drug problem, which is really a drug prohibition problem in our communities. So, the easiest way to get those numbers is to clear corners. We have drug dealers standing on corners. We have kids standing on corners peddling drugs. We have plenty of people coming up and buying those drugs. So we have plenty of users, those who are addicted. And it's very easy to go into such a community and just round up people. The quality of the arrest does not matter, because in policing, we no longer look at or are concerned about conviction rates. It's all about the arrest. We don't dare go into gated America. We don't dare take drug dogs into Roland Park in Baltimore, Maryland, which is due north of downtown, and start scanning cars along the street, or doing knock and talks on, at these prestigious homes where we know they have parties on occasion. We don't dare go to one of the affluent high schools and scan the cars in the parking lots of the students, because we would be getting phone calls, not the police, but the chief and the mayor and the city council members will be getting the phone calls, and that would soon stop. So those are just a couple of quick reasons as to why we tend to target communities of color, poor communities, as it relates to enforcing these drug policies.
Neill, when you mentioned that, I worked in a very melanin deficient community for 20 years. And we had just as much drug use in that community as any place else in America. But one of the big differences is, and you touched on, I just wanted to add this to it, in the inner city, as you said, it's open marketplace. It's out of the street. In the suburbs, I call it dining room marketplace. Mm-hmm. And basically the way most of the dealing is done in the suburbs is there's a group of people, and they have one person who's got a connection who goes get the drugs for everybody else. And then they come back and they meet at one house over the dining room table, and they distribute the drugs. And that guy that's getting it isn't looking for any new customers. He's in it or she's in it because they get their drugs for free because they run and get it for everybody else. And it's very difficult to get a narc into that type of operation. And it's not out on the street corner. So a lot of it is that marketplace. But there is also a huge racial component to this thing. You got to remember that during alcohol prohibition, the vast number of people we locked up were Catholic Italians and Irish and Jews. They were the underground marketplace. And the reason wasn't because there was something genetically wrong with those people. The reason was because they were pushed out because of being Catholic and Jews in this society, the early part of the 20th century. They were pushed out of the regular marketplace. My mother, who was born in 1904, remembers reading in the Buffalo newspaper in the teens, and there would be ads that would say man needed to do work, and the last line of the ad would say Catholics need not apply. So there's been an extended racial component to all of our drug laws. Larry, you with us?
Yes, sir, I am.
Yeah, you want to get in here?
Sure. How are you guys doing today? This sounds like
Larry.
a lot of fun.
Just for anyone who might have missed the introduction, Larry Talley is a 20-year veteran of the Navy, doing counter-drug work for seemingly quite a bit of that. 7 of those years with the Naval Special Warfare Unit in Panama, doing counter-drug, I mentioned some interdiction and also eradication work with the DEA and with just the Navy. So certainly a unique and interesting perspective on this topic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, the military aspect or paradigm of the drug war is significantly different than the man on the ground who's dealing with the end users. I joined the Navy in the 80s, and I'd never intended to get into the drug war. My job, I wanted to be an intelligence guy and do all kinds of stuff with the bad guys. And, my first job was they put me on a ship. I was in an intel. They put me on a ship, and the first thing that I did was help to assimilate a 19-ton marijuana bust from a bunch of Rastafarians on rafts that were coming out of Grenada. So, since then, I've changed my perspective. As a kid and early in the Navy and wanting to do the right thing, I learned that, prohibition just very simply, and I mean prohibition of all drugs, just simply doesn't work. And we learned that during alcohol prohibition. Now, in the 4 decades since President Nixon has declared a war on drugs, now our strategies remain pretty much unchanged. And in fact, our society's turned into the world's largest industrial prison complex, with more than 25% of the world's prison population. I think we browbeat that one to death. But, while the annual counter-drug budget's ballooned to $25 billion every year, the availability of our illicit drugs here in the United States remains at an all-time high. I can remember wanting to charge through a drug-free America by 1995 and then 1996. And then we gave up. We took away the Cali and the Medellin cartels. I was involved in that. And those were the cocaine cartels that were bringing lots of cocaine into the 80s, into southern Florida, Miami Vice, and that time period, and Scarface. Well, we got rid of those Cali and the Medellin cartels, and then it became a distributed effort of drug distributing, and we've lost control. Now, since then, we've lost a lot of people. Nearly 40,000 drug-related deaths here in the United States every year. That's 40,000 drug-related deaths every year here in the United States. More than 60,000 deaths in Mexico. The global drug trade now accounts for about 1% of all commerce on the planet. And we pursued essentially the same flawed supply reduction strategy for years. And that's where the military was involved, in that supply reduction strategy through interdiction. Interdiction means that we go bust boats that have coke on it. We find the motherships. We try to interdict the drug trade, but really we're accounting for just a very small piece, micro percentage of the drug trade by spending billions of dollars of our tax dollars trying to do that. Now we have wasted. Let's talk about the overall. We've wasted $1.5 trillion arrested, jailing, and killing our citizens with an increasingly militarized police force. We have essentially created a war to force a disproportionate moral code on all Americans. Now, the prohibition of illegal drugs has not only failed in its promises, but it's actually created additional serious and disturbing problems throughout our society. Now, repealing the prohibition of drugs, that does not mean that we endorse their use. It's very simply a call for different or wiser health and law enforcement and public health policies. Now, here in the United States, the prohibition have given control of the production and distribution of drugs to cartels and street gangs. Well, this very simply promotes disrespect for law enforcement, and this also reinforces the ethnic and generational divides between the public and law enforcement. Now, every year, more than 3/4 of Americans are a million Americans. 3/4 of a million Americans are arrested for marijuana possession, just marijuana possession alone. That's far more than all of those arrested for violent crimes in America. Think about that for a minute. We're arresting more people in America just for possessing marijuana than we're arresting for violent crimes. And a lot of violent crimes are now going unsolved unprosecuted. Now, the cost of just marijuana prohibition exceeds $12 billion a year. The cost of drug prohibition exceeds $85 billion a year. There's not less drugs in the Republic of the United States. There is more. There's not less crime. There's more. The cost of government is not smaller. It's vastly greater, and the respect for law enforcement has not increased, but it's diminished as a result of this. Now, as Americans, everybody, every single one of us, we need to urge our leaders to support the passage of legislation to remove these penalties and to change the conversation, to regulate the use and production and sale, as is done with other addictive and deadly and dangerous substances, such as liquor. You know, the promotion of the continued production of what we're doing here in this country of the prohibition is just very simply tearing this country apart. And what we need to do is change that and have a conversation so that we can finally ring these bells of freedom, because it's been a while.
Larry, I was wondering if you could talk. I mean, you mentioned. Thank you very much for that. You mentioned that you did not join the Navy to combat drugs. I imagine that's true of most people who became police officers as well. Sort of why is the U.S. military involved in the drug war?
Well, why is the Drug Enforcement Agency involved in the drug war in Mexico? I mean, that's as a military guy, I have to ask that question. Where we send drug enforcement agents to different parts of the world in drug interdiction, and we send military people to different parts of the world to deal with insurgents. Well, the military is involved in the drug trade largely because it's an incredibly lucrative opportunity for the military. There's a counter-drug office in the military that handles the money that comes from various programs funneled throughout the United States government. And this big pot of money is then accessible to military unit commanders. And what that enables military to do is use that money for missions that may be associated with counter-drugs. So what we've done with counter-drug money, for instance, in the Republic of Panama, our particular unit was involved in foreign internal defense missions. So that would be we would send a unit of people down to train a foreign military or police department on military interdiction operations, law enforcement operations. And then from the interdiction side, this goes back to the 1980s when Reagan just started his Say No campaign to drugs, and we started drug interdiction operations in and around the Caribbean Ocean, where we had a large amount of cocaine coming through. And something about government bureaucracies and government programs, once you turn them off, they rarely ever turn them on. They rarely get turned off. So once we started funneling money into an account for counter drugs for the military, then it was just it was a food bowl for the military and every military unit to try to get into that food bowl to get a piece of that money to justify more work and more jobs and just growth. It's just government bureaucracy at its finest.
Larry?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Peter here. I just want to, I think, make a correction. I think you said that we spend $12 million a year on marijuana and $83 million a year on all other drugs. I think that's billion. Billion, right. Okay. I thought you said billion. I just want to make sure everybody understands we're talking about $12 billion and $83 billion.
I was saying in my head billion. I can't believe that came out of my mouth wrong. Thank you very much for that change, Chris, for that fix. I was saying
Mike,
billion. I'm trying to say trillion.
Hey, Larry, this is Neill. You mentioned when we were moving towards this drug-free America, you mentioned a couple of cartel organizations that you guys took down for cocaine. So we should have less cocaine coming into the country. Is that not true?
Well, that was, that's absolutely right. We were talking about the Cali and the Medellin cartels, and I worked for General Bowray and the gentleman that took over as the drug czar for President Bill Clinton, and the name escapes me, but I worked for him. Thank you. Barry McCaffrey. So the idea was from the State Department, from President Reagan on down, and Barry McCaffrey was he was the SINC, and that's commanding officer in charge of everything that's south of, let's say, south of Texas at the time. That get counted into the South American foray. So he was in charge of all that. So what he believed, and after working with the CIA and State Department, that if we were to cut off the heads of those cartels, that we could stem the flow of cocaine. We would then begin to control it. Now, there was a large conversation with large numbers of people throughout various different government organizations that didn't believe that would be the case, that we had evidence that showed that there would be a distributed network that would just simply pop up and fill in the void. Very much like, Neill, how you guys have to deal with that same kind of concept on the street. When you get rid of a drug dealer, there's another guy that's going to pop up, pull the drugs out of his pocket and say, you know what? I'm here now and I can sell it to you cheaper. That's exactly what happened when we got rid of the big cartels. It's the same concept. It's the same program, whether it's a dealer on the street, a dealer in a building in downtown Atlanta, or if it's a cartel leader that's in South America. The minute that you got rid of that guy, that void, that huge organized void was filled up by hundreds of individuals. And therefore, we had, after the takedown of the Cali and the Medellin cartels, we didn't have less cocaine. We had more. We didn't have less crime. We didn't have less killing. We had more. It ballooned. It got so bad.
So the federal government, they tout the success in Colombia, that you were referring to, of reducing the tonnage of cocaine significantly coming out of Colombia. So what happened? If they had this wonderful success in Colombia, where's the cocaine coming from?
Well, that's where the guys in Bolivia, the guys in Brazil, the guys in Peru, and then the guys in Mexico, because then Mexico became the next big producer and distributor of cocaine. It got picked up by everybody else. And we were seeing that happen just as we were down in Panama and as we took out the Cali and the Medellin cartel, our focus immediately turned to Bolivia. And we were doing Bolivian operations, and then Belize, and then Colombia again, and then Peru. And then we pretty much lost control while we were down there. And I didn't want to be involved in that unit and that kind of work anymore, and I left after that. It was sickening. It was really sickening. I've talked to so many DEA agents who disagreed with the way that we went. At least at one point in time, we had some level, and it's not a good word to say, but we had some level of control. We had some level of monitoring with the Cali and the Medellin cartels. We could see the drugs coming across. We all know that the real answer is going to be a regulation,
right?
Tax and regulate. It just doesn't work.
And I think the problem that you're highlighting right there, and this is Mike Cindrich from San Diego, is that we've been focusing on the supply, and if you cut one head off, another 10 heads spring up. And I think you hit the nail right on the head there. Is we need to focus on the demand, and we need to focus on the issues here in our country. And I think that will help a lot of the things that are happening in South America and other countries abroad.
Right. And, one thing that's always interesting to me, of course, is as the federal government tries to implement Plan Merida in Mexico, they often cite Colombia as an example of how we can be successful by offering that sort of aid package. But, today the murder rate in Colombia is higher than the murder rate in Mexico. But nobody talks about that. We continue to hold that and as you mentioned, the toppling of the cartels back in the day as a metric of success. Mike, I was wondering, the military involvement in the war on drugs and the international U.S. effort in the war on drugs, I think raises some legal questions. And I understand that admiralty law and international law are sort of distinct. But, is it legal for the United States to be doing that, right? Is the extraterritorial authority under Title 21, 959, where we can indict a foreign national who's never stepped foot in the United States? Is it legal for us to send Navy and Coast Guard vessels all around the hemisphere interdicting foreign flagged vessels in search of drugs? Are there any? It seems that there are a lot of legal issues that arise, and that I don't hear them challenged very often.
No, I think the legality is extremely questionable, I think international law, when you look at it, it wouldn't really allow many of the things that the United States government has been doing. However, because of this general consensus that we need to fight this war and that things need to be done, I think a lot of countries are probably just kind of turning the other way and letting us do this. I guess they must be thinking that the benefits outweigh the costs, so they're just turning their heads. But yeah, I think it raises some very important issues, and I think in many cases it's not legal what our government is doing.
That's interesting. And of course we see in certain countries in Latin America the beginning of some pushback against the U.S. Big stick approach to drug policy. Uruguay, of course, and statements that have been made by Mexican leaders, and particularly former Mexican leaders as well. So it's interesting. Larry, I was wondering. I think an experience for many people in LEAP is that even before their retirement or resignation, and even before formally joining on with LEAP, that they knew coworkers who felt the same way, who were sympathetic. I mean, this isn't something that, one officer in every department comes to realize, that the war on drugs is a failure. I was wondering how your fellow sailors felt about the war on drugs, interdiction strategy, and the use of military forces to implement that strategy.
For the most part, it's getting the job done, and let's just get the job done. I got that attitude a lot from when I start sitting down and talking to policy. I guess when I've talked to some very senior military officers, some of them have agreed. I think it really does take someone to be shown. It takes an education experience, maybe an epiphany, a come to Jesus moment for some people before they get it. I was one of those guys. It wasn't until we were conducting an operation and it was in Bolivia. We were training a foreign internal defense Bolivian Special Forces unit to conduct drug interdiction training. And so in one particular instance, we went out to this field in Bolivia. We flew in early in the morning to a house that was on a track of other houses. It was on a Bolivian hillside. Houses were separated by several hundred yards, but each of them had probably 3 to 5, maybe 10 acres, depending on the house, of a tract of land. And each one of these houses, they grew coca. And that's what they did. It's what these people had done for generations, and it was a family that lived in the house, and that's what they did. They had their land, they grew coca, they sold coca, they got up, they made breakfast. It's what they did every day. And there was a neighborhood of houses that did this. So we flew in with the Bolivian Special Forces early one morning to one of these houses, and we were there as advisors, and I watched the Bolivian Special Forces run into this house. And, of course, I'm expecting them to pull out some guy with no teeth, looks like Pablo Escobar, what they pulled out was 7 kids. I'll never forget those children. I pulled out 7 kids, flex cuffed them on the ground. The youngest was crying. She was 1, 2, 3 years old, flex cuffed on the ground. And they pulled out the mother and the father. Then they went out there with a helicopter. In the helicopters, they brought out fuel, and they burned their house down, and they burned down that tract of coca. So I was asking the unit commander, and I was asking my commanding officer at the time, who was standing right there as the officer in charge, why the hell are we doing this? What are we doing? This is not moral. This isn't correct. This isn't American. This isn't Christian. This isn't right. And I said, all we're doing today is we're making enemies of the United States and the Bolivian government. Why the hell are you doing that? And they said, well, this is what interdiction is. This is what we do. And then they sent those people marching down the street with no Red Cross to help them. They didn't even arrest them. They just burned everything that they had. That's my come to Jesus moment. And that was a come to Jesus moment that everybody I stood with, every American that stood there that day, realized what we had done. And so we tried to educate the rest of our chain of command. There was a lot of consternation within our organization internally as a result of that one particular operation, and there was some discussions, high-level discussions above my head, and I don't know what was ever said. We continued to do those operations, and then I quit that unit, and I went on to different things. So to answer your question, there's a lot of good people in the military, and I'm going to tell you that most of those people, they believe in that oath that they swore to serve and protect the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And you got a large sleeping force of the United States out there who aren't against the citizens. These are people who are mostly, if educated and shown, would agree with us here today. I wish we could make some of this kind of stuff mandatory training for military, Constitution training. I think that would help. I hope I answered your question.
That's a very interesting response, Larry, because when you mention training, educating the troops as to what this really is and what's happening, there's been some discussion about doing the same thing in law enforcement academies. How many of these young police officers, if they really knew what this was all about and the damage that's being done to our communities and to the citizens, would they just march out there and follow orders? Would they just see this as, hey, we're the executive branch of the government. All we do is enforce the policies that are placed in front of us. And I think that's what we need to do more of and figure out how we do that, how we educate more people who are in positions of responsibility for enforcing these policies, both in the military, in the DEA, law enforcement in our communities. How do we do that? How can we do that? One of the big problems that we have with law enforcement here in the U.S. is that it's a very closed culture. Most cops have cops as friends, and it truly has become this us versus them society. And so, getting into that culture, breaking through that shell, educating these police officers, and at the end of the day, having them become stronger advocates for ending this policy.
Yeah, I think the hierarchy, creates an issue, especially in the military. I'm sure, I'm not former military, but I can imagine. But, from my experience at the district attorney's office, we take an oath to uphold the Constitution and uphold the laws of the state of California. But really, it's not my decision which cases I'm going to prosecute or which cases I'm going to dismiss. I mean, I may feel that I have a case that, this case needs to be dismissed. Either, we didn't follow the proper procedures in search and seizure or whatever, but it's really not my choice. It's my supervisor's choice, and it's their supervisor's choice. And really, the people at the bottom kind of just have to take the marching orders. And I think it's going to take people who realize that, hey, if I don't feel strongly about this and I'm taking orders from someone and I feel I'm not upholding my oath, then I need to do something about it. And whether it's, take a stance right there or just leave that position and go to another side and, promote the ideals that you took the oath to uphold. And I think that that's going to be extremely important. And that really just comes down to the citizen. And that comes down to keeping faith that there are good people in law enforcement, that there are good people in the military, that there are good people in the prosecuting agencies that will either take a stand or leave and do something different.
Mike, if we could just follow up on that a little bit. One thing that struck me during my time with DEA is how incredibly stacked the cards are in favor of the government in drug cases. The vast majority, of course, at the federal level plead out because of that that stacking of the deck. The ones that go to court are almost always result in conviction. In theory, we have a system of innocent until proven guilty, and the bar for successful prosecution should be very, very high. But that seems not to be the case. I mean, it seems that the system increasingly, I don't want to use the word rigged because that would imply corruption, but it certainly seems to favor prosecutors over defendants. And I just wondering, do you think most drug case defendants get a fair trial and are treated fairly by the judicial system?
No, most don't think so. I think the system is absolutely stacked, even from the initial arraignment and bail hearing. When you're making a bail argument, the court has to assume that everything that the prosecutor is saying is true. So they assume that the police report and that these statements that everything's true, and then bail gets set, and oftentimes people can't even get out of custody to fight their case. And many times these are innocent people. Even more so in California, when we see with the medical marijuana defense. The medical marijuana laws in California, they don't protect you from arrest. They give you a defense in court should you get prosecuted. So you may get a DA's office that just doesn't like the laws, doesn't agree with them, and they're going to arrest and prosecute everyone, leave it up to you to defend yourself in court. But that's even if you're in full compliance with the law, you still get arrested. You still have to post bail. You have to hire an attorney. You have to go to court and have to go through all that. And even if you win at the end, you're still out of pocket several $1,000s and, time in your life that you spent and all the stress of being in court. But I think absolutely the cards are stacked against defendants in just about every case. And I think, unfortunately, the general population just feels, hey, if someone's sitting in the defendant's chair, they must have done something, which we know is not always the case.
No, that's right. And, the bar for an indictment is virtually non-existent. And I can't believe that that's how, by design, the system was supposed to work. It's unheard of, at least in my experience, for an AUSA to want to indict an individual and have the grand jury come back and not indict. So it certainly seems unfair and, as you mentioned, expensive, right? And affects people in ways, even if they are ultimately not convicted. It's still a huge disruption and a cost.
Well, I tell you, if you really wanted a more fair system, judicial system, then every case should be a jury trial. There should be no plea bargains. Everybody should be judged by their peers and have that opportunity. But this plea system, the use of public defenders whose caseloads are just ungodly in the numbers, and the way charges are stacked up upon someone, a person or a suspect, are in many cases improper, and which forces them into some sort of plea deal. But if you want a fair system, then everyone should have a jury trial. Everyone should have the opportunity to present and defend their case in front of their peers. And especially for these drug laws that we currently have, I think that if that were the case, you'd have far fewer people being convicted and going to and spending time in prison. And then because of that, you would probably have far fewer people ever being charged in the first place.
Just as a quick comment, I want to remind the audience, everybody that you are listening to here has been involved in depriving people of their liberty because of the drug war. We have all enforced these laws, and we've done it, whether we've prosecuted, whether we've been police officers, whether we've been in the military. We're not talking about this from some outside view. We're talking about this from a deep inside view of our old profession, and we know what we're capable of doing, and we know what we are absolutely incapable of doing because it is contrary to the concept of law enforcement. So I just want to remind everybody of who they're listening to on this.
I think Neill made a solid point. The plea bargain system is it's just a horrible system. I mean, especially in federal court, but even in state court, we'll see the prosecutors. They'll just charge any possible offense that you can even think of. They'll throw it all against the wall and see what sticks. The problem is they make the offers, prior to a preliminary hearing, and they say, hey, if your client goes to preliminary hearing, all offers are off the table. Well, I know that I can get some of those charges dismissed at prelim, but if we go forward, some of them are going to stand, and then my clients might not be able to get as good of a deal after preliminary hearing. So, it really, in some cases, I strongly believe is unethical. I get prosecutors that file a case, they issue charges, and they come to me at the first court hearing and say, you're going to file a motion to suppress evidence, aren't you? Yes, I am. Because, of course, my client's rights were violated. Truly what the prosecutor's office should be doing is looking at these cases and saying, you know what? This person's rights were violated. We shouldn't file charges in this case. But what they do is they file charges and then they force us to file motions and hope that we get a judge that will listen to that motion and will consider the law and grant that motion. But really, the prosecuting agencies should be not issuing cases when they see violations of constitutional rights.
Right. One of the I think abuses in that system and in how the prosecutorial system works, and within law enforcement as well, is how informants, right, human confidential sources, are recruited, used, compensated. And I was just wondering how you feel about that technique. Do you think the government relies on it too heavily? Is it dangerous? Have you seen any particular abuses in that?
Was that question for Mike?
Yes, I'm sorry, Mike, yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see it all the time. And in many cases, we see it where, someone, they get busted for personal use or small level dealing, and then they get forced to be an informant. And it's basically, hey, lose your freedom or, help us take away someone else's freedom. And it is used, it is abused, and we see it all too often. And unfortunately, oftentimes these informants, they are considered confidential. And one thing that we like to do is we like to file motions to try to learn the identity of those informants, because they may have information that can help with our case. And I think when you're relying on this, you need to see, okay, well, has this person actually given information in the past that's helped in these in law enforcement investigations, and to what extent have they? Because oftentimes that's what's relied upon for warrants and for allowing the use of these informants and allowing them to remain confidential, is that they have served a certain function in the past. But we really don't get an opportunity to challenge that without knowing who they are and what type of information they've provided. But I think there is definitely an abuse in the system with confidential informants.
Yeah, for working with the two largest police agencies in the state of Maryland, when I was with the Maryland State Police, we had a very regulated and tightly controlled CI system and program where you had to document every single minute you spent with an informant, every single bit of information coming from an informant. When we did control buys, we really did strip searches of those informants, of those CIs. And it was a very regulated, controlled, and also reviewed program. Now go to Baltimore City, and you're looking at a completely different animal. There were abuses around every corner. As a matter of fact, they even reflected some of the abuses, unfortunately, in the HBO series The Wire. And if you do not know how to properly manage a CI, mainly those who are under the gun and who will do just about anything not to spend any time in prison, you're really you're biting off more than you can chew, and we do end up, unfortunately, charging and convicting people who were in fact innocent because of the lack of oversight and control of the CI program in Baltimore.
And Larry, does you mentioned you were on the ground in Bolivia, but probably not where you expected to find yourself joining the Navy. but does the U.S. military use informants overseas as well for drug, not cases, but interdiction and eradication efforts?
Not too much. No, we get the military doesn't do a lot of these independently. They work with a support structure, an organization, a joint command called JIATF, Joint Intelligence. I forgot what the rest of it, Task Force, Joint Intelligence Analyst Task Force or something like that. There used to be a couple of those commands. They've reorganized into one, and they're in Miami, Florida now. So what the Navy does is they might have a ship at sea or unit on the ground. There is a central command that knows where all these units are at, and they will task them, and it's a fleet surveillance unit that's out in Chesapeake, Virginia. So they'll task these in units with the ones that are mobile, that are moving, with prosecuting a ship or a plane or something along those lines. If you guys remember, some years ago, there was a shoot down of an aircraft over in Peru, Andean Ridge area. Mm-hmm. That was from this command in Virginia. They were involved with that particular shoot down, in that they did not order it. I'll reiterate that it was a Peruvian fighter jet that ultimately shot down that aircraft, and that was ultimately against the orders of the military that didn't want to prosecute that plane. It showed signs that it was a prosecutable target, that it was probably carrying drugs, but they didn't know for sure. Aircraft ordered it down, and it crashed. So they shot it down. I'm sorry. I hope did that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I was just wondering. I mean, you're right, because sort of what assets are used to to pinpoint, as you mentioned, the coca grow earlier.
And we might have radars over an area. As far as the use of informants, let's say we teach that to the foreign intelligence agents. So if we're working with the Bolivian Special Forces, we're teaching the Bolivian Special Forces how to operate as a law enforcement and a military entity. So in that particular instance, when they prosecuted that target that was out in Bolivia, which was the house with the kids in the coca field, that particular target was chosen by them because of an informant or something along those lines gave them information. What we were worried about as we were watching these foreign governments begin to develop the culture where they had informants, that things were actually being done very politically. Why did they choose that house over the house next door? Well, ultimately, I think the answer was that somebody in law enforcement didn't like the guy that lived in that house, or there was something personal involved. So they chose that house for that reason. Whereas we have checks and balances in place, and we try to ensure those types of things don't happen. That doesn't necessarily happen in foreign governments. They don't have a lot of the laws in place already to keep that from happening. So, yeah, while our military doesn't use informants, there are informants ultimately that are used.
Right. Mike, I was wondering, I'm sure you saw John Schiffman from Reuters' article about the DEA's use of classified information, particularly phone information, and how that's passed to field agents through the Special Operations Division. And then, when it reaches the point of being judicialized, right, agents and prosecutors are instructed to kind of work what's called parallel construction, where they reconstruct the information that was obtained from a classified source in a way that can be presented to a judge and a jury in the judicial process. I was really wondering what your thoughts are on that. Some attorneys have raised constitutional questions and whether that process violates the rules for discovery. Would you have a problem with as a former prosecutor, with an agent using that tactic?
Well, as a former prosecutor, now a defense attorney, I have a huge problem with that, and I'm pretty appalled at the fact that they do that. it definitely goes against everything that the discovery process stands for. I mean, part of protecting our constitutional rights, the constitutional rights of our clients, is seeing the procedures and the exact procedures that were followed when obtaining evidence and obtaining information that's going to be used against someone. And when you kind of deconstruct that and put it back together, you're taking the truth out of how it really happened, and you take away our ability to be able to test the constitutionality of those procedures. So, I have a huge issue with it, and I just, I can't stress enough how people's rights are being violated on a daily basis, and it's hard enough. There's so much stacked against us as defense attorneys and representing defendants, and then to add another layer like that, to where even the prosecutor doesn't necessarily know everything that took place. And the prosecutor does have a certain duty to investigate and try to determine exactly what discovery exists. And they can't really use as an excuse, we didn't know about it, or they didn't give us that information. They have a duty to investigate and to try to find out that information. But when you have the actual agency that's doing the investigating, covering up certain things and changing around the way that it was actually done, and then giving it to the prosecutor. I mean, I can't stress enough how much that just violates our constitutional rights, and I'm appalled at it.
Sean?
Yes.
I want to jump in because we're coming up on to the end of this, and I just wanted to say to Neill, if you want to do a little plug for Leap, Neill, and tell us if there's anything coming up that you want to mention or anything like that.
Well, sure. First of all, I want to make sure that everyone who's listening has gone onto the Leap website, which is leap.cc, or copssaylegalizedrugs.com, and make sure you have signed on as a supporter to this wonderful organization. So that's first and foremost. As far as what lies ahead for Leap, many things lie ahead, but there's one thing that I want to point out, is that for you listeners who realize that we have to make a serious change regarding our drug policy in this country, and many of you know some of your political leaders, your delegates, senators, even your city council members, and some of our members on Capitol Hill. You don't have to be the one to try to explain this to them. If you reach out to LEAP, you can do that through our website. If at all possible, and in most of the times it is, we will send someone with you. We will partner someone with you, one of our wonderful speakers, to go with you to meet with one of your political leaders in urging them to support drug policy reform in this country and support some of the legislation that is out there that needs to be passed. So I just wanted to make that clear. Reach out to us, contact our Speakers Bureau, get a speaker in your area for your local Rotary, for your local Kiwanis Club, colleges, universities, anyone, any group. We will come share our message and help end this disastrous drug war.
Well, thank you very much, Neill. I want to thank everybody that was involved in this today. I think this is a very powerful 2 hours, and I hope a lot of people listen to it. I'm going to end this one for my part by saying what I usually say at the end of the regular Time for Hemp show, and that is, bad things happen because good people stay silent. Casper?
Well, it really has been quite an honor to be part of this historic broadcast and to be able to bring it to my audience. I want to thank the members of LEAP and let everybody know how important it is to get involved with LEAP. There's a lot of excellent speakers there that are willing to come out into any community to help let people know how important it is to end prohibition. Time for Hemp has put together this global presentation, and we are asking you, the members of our audience, to pick up the torch where we have to leave it, and that is at your doorstep. It is important that you take these MP3s, you'll find them at timeforhemp.com, and to send these to your leaders here in Washington, D.C., and all around the world, so that everybody knows how important it is to take time for hemp.
Don't cut trees for paper, 'cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yes, it's time for hemp. Whoa, an acre of hemp makes 20 bales of oil.
Hi, I'm Scott with Flex Your Rights. This is a video that I've been promising to do for a while now, so I hope you find it helpful. We've talked a lot about why you should refuse police searches, and you should check out my video, 5 Reasons You Should Never Agree to a Police Search, if you need to hear more about that. But here's the thing that keeps coming up. A lot of folks have pointed out that refusing a police search doesn't just make the cops disappear in a poof of smoke. And that's true, it doesn't. I mean, lots of difficult things can happen after you refuse a police search. So let's talk about what those things are. And one of the main points I want to get across here is that just because you're afraid of what might happen after you refuse a search, after you assert your rights, it's still your best move. And so that's important to understand. And I want to make it clear to everybody that I'm not clueless about all of the ways that this stuff can go wrong, because we get that response a lot. Like, are you out of your mind? If you assert your rights, the police are just going to do this or they're going to do that. We're very familiar with some of the things that they can do. And so let's talk about them and how your constitutional rights apply even in some of those worst case kind of scenarios. So let's get into it here. Say the cops pull you over for something kind of trivial, like an unsafe lane change, like sort of one of those catch-all kind of things, that the excuses that they use. But they're basically just profiling you. And soon enough, they're asking to search your car. And you say, no, officer, I'm sorry, I'm not consenting to any searches. So now, one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to search you or they aren't. First of all, obviously, if they don't search you, then hooray for you, you win. You get to drive home safely. And, this is actually a very real possibility. Officers really will back down in many cases because they simply don't have probable cause. And, not every cop is a corrupt scumbag who's going to make stuff up or give you a really hard time. So understand that this does happen. I mean, I get emails all the time from people who refused to search and then didn't get searched. The combination of properly asserting your constitutional rights and coming across as a calm, potentially innocent person, and the police officer actually lacking probable cause, not really having a valid reason that they can cite to search your vehicle. All of those three things can come together, and you really might not get searched. But as many of you have pointed out, things often just aren't nearly that easy. In many cases, when you refuse a police search, the officer will threaten you with all sorts of things, and this is where it gets really tough for you to hold your ground. Keep in mind that police can lie, so they might say they can impound your car, which is bull. They'll make all sorts of threats, but remember one thing. They're trying to get you to say that it's okay to search. See, if your consent didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying so hard to get it. So now you're basically playing a high-stakes game with the officer. Their job is to make you say it's okay to search the car, and your job is not to say that that's okay, no matter how hard they pressure you. So it's a battle of wits, basically. And once you get into this situation, the next thing you need to do is ask if you're free to go. This is important because the officer not only needs to have a legal reason to search you, but they also need a legal reason to even hold you by the side of the road. And unless you say that you want to leave, then the law considers the encounter voluntary. So keep this in mind. For example, if you refuse a search and then the officer threatens to call in the drug-sniffing dogs, which is something that they'll do in many situations, the officer can legally call a dog anytime he wants, but the officer can't legally detain you without evidence. So if asking if you're free to go can provide legal protection against that dog sniff. So now let's talk about the worst case scenario. You've refused a search and you've asked if you're free to go. And you've done both of these things very politely, which is important. But they don't let you go and they do search you and you get arrested for something stupid like, say, fireworks. You still did the right things. You asserted your constitutional rights, and the circumstances of your arrest do matter in a court of law. I mean, honestly, it's actually even really common for charges to get dropped before you even go to court. If the magistrate looks at the case and realizes that it's not likely to hold up, that's a jurisdictional thing that varies from place to place. But I do hear about areas where sometimes the police are a little bit overzealous and make a lot of petty, marijuana arrests or things like that. And those cases don't always even result in actual criminal charges. But if you are charged, as will often be the case, then your lawyer has some really solid legal grounds on which to challenge the evidence against you. And this is really typical stuff. I mean, when, in any criminal case, one of the first things that happens is your lawyer would make a motion to suppress and challenge any evidence that that he or she feels was illegally obtained against you. And so evidence resulting from a search that you didn't consent to, evidence that was turned up during a prolonged detention when you'd asked if you were free to leave and they didn't actually turn out to have legal grounds to detain you. All of those things are eligible for suppression. And if you talk to any good criminal defense attorney, these kinds of hearings are things that they can win. They win this stuff. Not every time, but there's a system here. And so that's really why it's so important to understand how to assert these particular rights. Even if you're convinced that the officer doesn't care about your rights, even if you're convinced that the officer is going to search you anyway, the point is that you have to create legal grounds on which to challenge the officer's conduct later on. And this can also apply to civil rights lawsuits, to other types of situations if you're filing a complaint, all of these things. If you agree to be detained, if you agree to be searched, you can't challenge the officer's actions. And obviously, a police encounter can go wrong in any number of ways, and police do routinely violate people's rights in horrible ways and in all sorts of situations. So, I can't promise you a good outcome. I can't promise you some of the better outcomes that I've enumerated today. But I can tell you how to increase your odds of getting those best outcomes, and so that's really what this is about. So, please understand that the fear that your rights might be violated is all the more reason to know and assert those rights in any and every police encounter. So please keep that in mind, and please be safe out there. As always, all of our videos, including our very cool instructional videos, are available on YouTube as well. So check those out, and please visit our website for more information. We have an excellent FAQ, and you can also order DVD copies of our videos if you're interested in making a donation, and we do really appreciate your support there. So thanks so much, and be safe, everyone.
Free? Did you say free? Free hemp? Free hemp? Free hemp video and audio? Free downloads of all the top artists, all the pot artists on planet Earth. Interviews with all the people making the movement, making the hemp movement. It's time for hemp. That's right, world. It's time for hemp. That's right, world. It's time for hemp.